As a scientific theory, evolution claims to explain the origin of all biological traits, such as flying, swimming, and intelligence. A closer look reveals that evolution lacks any genetic mechanism to account for the origin of these traits. Instead, the biblical creation model fits smoothly within much of what is currently known about inheritance and genetics. Coming up on today's edition of Origins, Climbing Mount Improbable with Dr. Kevin Anderson. Hello and welcome to Origins. I'm Ray Heiple. It's an honor to be your host today. During this program, we showcase interesting guests who present evidence from science, along with other important facts, validating the truth of creation and the accuracy of the Bible. Today's guest, Dr. Kevin Anderson, received his PhD in microbiology and was a research fellow at the National Institutes of Health. He has served as a university professor, taught graduate-level molecular biology, directed the research of advanced degree students, and was the director of research for a biotech company. He has also written numerous technical publications and is currently the director of the Van Andel Creation Research Center in Arizona. Welcome to the program, Kevin.
Well, thank you for having me.
We are talking today about climbing Mount Improbable.
Yes.
What does that refer to?
Okay, that refers to an analogy of how evolution would actually have to work. See, evolution really is universal common descent. That is that a fish would develop legs and crawl up on land. This lizard-type creature would develop wings and feathers and fly, or grow hair and 2 legs and walk. And so universal common descent says that progressively over time, we've transformed from a fish to a lizard, to a bird, or to a mammal, to a human. And all that takes genetic activity. You have to change what's going on in the cell. So Climbing Mount Improbable is really taken from Richard Dawkins' book, Climbing Mount Improbable, where he tackles that question. How will evolution achieve this? How's it going to traverse this long evolutionary climb that's necessary?
So climbing upwards,
yes,
and complicated, and more developed.
Yes. So he says that universal common descent would really be like climbing a mountain. You're going to go from simple to complex. You're going to go from lower to higher, and you got to climb up that mountain. So what you're looking at is, here's a mountain. Okay, how do you get from here to way up there?
A lot of time and effort, right?
Yeah, you're going to have to, and that's the problem he's tackling in this book is, how do we get up there? How does evolution get up there? In his book, Climbing Mount Improbable, Dawkins says that only God would essay the mad task of leaping up the precipice in a single bound. Any designer capable of constructing the dazzling array of living things would have to be intelligent and complicated beyond all imagining.
Well, what's wrong with that?
Right, which we would agree with. But he uses that as a negative. Well, see, he's too complicated. He's too intelligent.
So evolution, random, unguided, unintelligent process is too intelligent for an intelligent God. Well, that's too intelligent for me to understand.
So he says, okay, Darwinism is going to solve this problem by breaking up the improbability of climbing the mountain into small, manageable parts. He says smearing out the luck needed, going around the back of Mount Improbable, and crawling up the gentle slope inch by million-year inch. So in other words, he says this is how evolution, this is how Darwinism climbs this very, very high mountain, is this nice little gentle path, a nice Sunday afternoon walk. You don't even recognize you're going up because it's so gentle and it's so slow. Mm-hmm. And so that's what he proposes as an explanation of how evolution would get up to the top of the mountain. So I want you to notice, and you already kind of referred to this, what Dawkins is actually saying is that random mutation and natural selection equals God.
That's what God is.
This super intelligence that he says is necessary to leap up to the top in one bound, we can replace by non-intelligence. And that's his argument.
So if we don't need God, then why talk about him?
That's his argument, is we can get rid of God. All we need is mutation and natural selection. So see, he sees mutations as the main mechanism for climbing the mountain. And we have a number of papers I've posted here that go into arguments how mutations will achieve the mountain climbing events. Okay, let's define a mutation very quickly. DNA's double-stranded molecule. See, you have, here's one strand, and here's the second strand. And on DNA, you have then letters like A and C and T and G. All right, now, what he's saying is if we change any of those letters, that's a mutation. So for example, on this example, we're going to change the C and the G to a T and an A. See, so now we have a mutation having occurred to the T and the A. All right, so that has the potential to change the genetic information in the cell. And perhaps it'll now allow the fish to grow legs, or perhaps it'll now allow the lizard to grow wings. And so his argument is we have these mutations accumulating generation after generation. Natural selection comes along and determines if that mutation is beneficial or not. And very slowly, as he says, inch by million-year inch, we climb up the mountain. So if the effects of mutations, then we can have some mutations that perhaps would make us more fit, make us better. Some mutations that would, of course, make us less fit, make us weaker. And then many mutations that are actually just neutral. They don't have any noticeable effect.
Okay.
So his argument would be that those mutations that make you more fit are the ones that are going to drive you on up the mountain.
And those are passed on, as they say,
Those
right?
would be generally passed on. So universal common descent, as we just showed, where the fish becomes the land creature, which then develops wings and flies, or develops two legs and walks. See, all of that then is driven by what would be called beneficial mutations, mutations that are positive to you. All right? What that requires us to understand is the difference between phenotype and genotype. Okay, phenotype refers to your physical characteristics, the color of your eyes, the shape of your head, the color of your hair, your height. Those are all phenotype. Genotype refers to the DNA, the genetics. Do you have the genetics for a particular trait? So what we see is the phenotype, the physical characteristics, but what's actually occurring with mutations is affecting the genotype. And all too often when people talk about mutations, they only refer to the phenotype. What's the physical effect it had? They don't go back and look at, well, what's the genetic effect that it had? And that's a vastly important concept to understand, and I'll explain as we go through this why that's important to understand. All right, so how beneficial are beneficial mutations? Well, beneficial mutations are almost exclusively identified by their phenotype. In other words, what effect did it have on your physical traits? Rarely do anybody talk about the genotype, especially when you're talking about things such as evolution. Dawkins, in his entire book, Climbing Mount Improbable, rarely talked about the genotype. It was almost always, here's the phenotype, so here's the physical changes that have occurred.
If you couldn't see it, then he just wasn't mentioning it.
If you didn't know what's going on at the DNA level, it's like, well, we don't care what's going on at the DNA level. We only care about what the physical features are.
We want to see the end result.
Yes.
And, yeah.
But my challenge is that's the wrong way to look at it, because what's going on at the DNA level is very, very important regardless of the physical traits. Yes, it may be beneficial, but that doesn't mean that there's not negative events going on genetically. Let's go through some examples, all right? Malaria resistance. If you live in a region where there's a lot of malaria, of course, you would like to have some kind of mutation that make you resistant. And in fact, there are some mutations. The example I'm given is called the Duffy protein. Okay? There is a protein on the surface of your red blood cells that the malaria protozoa likes to attach to infect your red blood cells, and you get malaria. Okay? It so happens that if you have a mutation that gets rid of that protein, you're more resistant to malaria. Now, if you live in a region where there's malaria, that'd be great.
That sounds good, but I'm waiting for the catch, because getting rid of something sounds bad to me.
The catch is that, okay, here we have a red blood cell with the Duffy protein. The malaria protozoa attaches, all right? Here we have one with no Duffy protein. The malaria protozoa does not attach. You have an increased resistance, but see, it's because you inactivated the gene to make the Duffy protein. So phenotypically, it's a benefit, but what did the mutation do? The mutation got rid of a pre-existing system. Follow that? Mm-hmm. You have the genetic system to make this protein. To become resistant, you get rid of that genetic system. So you actually knocked something out.
And that system probably had a useful function that now you don't have, which maybe we don't know yet.
Yes, yes, very much so. Very much so. Okay? DDT resistance in insects. Of course, this has been a big one, as they used to use DDT to spray to keep insect controlled, as they acquired a resistance. And many times you'll see evolutionists pose this, well, look, this resistance to DDT is such a wonderful example of evolution. You know, beneficial mutation, which certainly is beneficial to the insect. If it's being sprayed with DDT, then it kind of likes to be resistant. But here's what is one of the things that's happening in DDT resistance. You have a gene called CYP6G1, okay? Not real catchy original,
yeah,
but that's the
nobody names genes like Tom or Sally.
It makes a protein called P450. Now, resistance can occur if a mutation occurs in this gene such that you actually increase the production of P450. This increased production of this protein contributes to resistance of DDT resistance. All right, what's the phenotype? The phenotype is you're more resistant to DDT. But what's the genotype? The genotype is you've knocked out the original regulatory capabilities at the DNA level. So you've taken a system that was functioning just fine, you've disrupted it, and now, yes, you're resistant to DDT, but it's at the expense of a pre-existing system. Are you starting to see a trend here?
Yeah, you can get sort of an accidental benefit, but it's because something wrong happened.
It's because you have done a negative event in the cell. Let's look at HIV infection. If you are exposed to HIV, you certainly would like to be resistant. HIV will bind to a protein on what's called your T helper cell. The name of this protein is CCR5. HIV is a virus, and it will bind to that protein. Viruses have to bind to the cells in order to infect. If they can't bind to the cell, they can't infect. So HIV looks for this CCR5 protein in order to infect the T helper cell. If you have a mutation where you have lost the expression of this CCR5 protein, HIV will not infect you. Benefit. If you're exposed to HIV, that's a benefit. But again, look at the expense. It's at the cost of making a protein that you used to be able to make, but now you can't make it. And then in knocking it out, we may gain a specific benefit, but it's at the cost of pre-existing systems.
And it's interesting, even if we get the benefit, it's only sometimes, like if you're exposed to HIV, then the benefit helps you, but if you're not...
If you're not exposed to HIV, there'd be no benefit at all to this,
and
correct.
You still lose the function of that system.
You lose the CCR5 protein, correct.
This is fascinating, but we need to take a break. More on cell mutations after this. Welcome back to Origins. We're talking to Dr. Kevin Anderson, who's been sharing about climbing Mount Improbable. Kevin, can you remind us again what this mountain is that we're trying to climb?
It's an analogy of the increase of complexity necessary if evolution's going to move us from single cells to multi-cells to swimming creatures to fish to land animals, to birds, to humans.
So we have to get this more and more complicated life chain.
Correct.
And evolution.
Correct. And you got to climb up the mountain. And it's, how do you do that? And Dawkins proposed, let's do it by very, very slow, gradual changes up the back of the mountain. And we're going through some examples that are often offered by evolutionists of these slow, gradual changes. And what we're finding out is they're not climbing anything. They're starting with a pre-existing system and getting rid of it.
And this is cell mutations. That's what they're looking
right.
for.
This is DNA mutations in the cell. Exactly. Let's look at a couple more examples. Human lactose tolerance. Okay? If you are a small child, what's happening is you have a gene called the lactase gene, and it makes an enzyme called lactase. And that enzyme allows you to digest the milk sugar lactose. And so you can drink milk just fine, no problem. Now, as you pass through puberty and become an adult, what is supposed to happen is there's a gene called MC-MSEX, another one of those real fancy sounding genes, okay? And it makes a protein that actually blocks the production of the lactase enzyme. And so you become what we today would call lactose intolerant.
You don't have then that MC, and I don't either, that
Right.
MC-M6.
The product of it that blocks the lactase gene, correct. Yeah, so we're mutants.
We're mutants.
Yes.
Well, that means we're going up, though, according to Dawkins, right?
Exactly, but
we've
doesn't.
lost something.
Well,
Yeah,
we've lost something.
Yes. Wow.
Antibiotic resistance in bacteria. Oh, this is all the time thrown out. Well, this proves evolution. Antibiotic resistance, antibiotic resistance.
That's right. They say that bacteria are evolving.
Yes.
Yeah.
Antibiotic resistance is if you have a population of bacteria and you expose them to an antibiotic, a few of them might be resistant. And then those resistant ones now repopulate and they become the dominant population.
And they're like, you know, what do they call them? The strong, right? The powerful bacteria, but that's not really the case.
Not necessarily, but in the presence of the antibiotic, they're certainly the strong. So to the bacteria, this is a benefit because obviously the bacteria now doesn't die when you are being given the antibiotic. But let's look and see what's happening when they develop these resistances. For some antibiotics, resistance comes by loss of an enzyme activity, or halting of cell division, or loss of regulatory protein, or reduction of a regulatory protein, or loss of, reduction of, loss of, reduction of, loss of, reduction of. Do you catch what's happening here?
These bacteria are losing
They're losing
certain
some
abilities.
function. Typically, it's the function that the antibiotic is attacking, or it's a transport protein that the antibiotic uses to get into the cell. As the bacteria, I get rid of it so you can't get into the cell, you can't harm me. It's analogous to if your foot's caught in a bear trap, and here comes the bear. What do you do?
I play dead, maybe. I don't know.
Well, maybe, yeah. You might go as severe as try to chop your leg off to get away from the bear. Now, humans would pay a terrible price for that because you've lost that leg permanently. But see, bacteria can chop the leg off, then they'll grow it back later on. Oh, wow. So they're quite willing to give up some of these functions in the presence of the antibiotic to become resistant because many times they'll regain that enzyme, they'll regain that transport protein when the antibiotic is now gone.
You know, it's probably begging the question, or maybe a little bit too far off subject, but if evolution is true, why don't we have that ability to cut off a limb and grow it back? I mean, that would seem like something you'd want to keep.
Well, I guess that's still to come. That's still the next stages of evolution, yes. But what do we see here with antibiotic resistance? Is this really moving us up the mountain? Is this an example of how you go up inch by million inch?
Yeah, you haven't gained anything. You haven't made anything new. You haven't gained anything.
Exactly.
You've lost
it's all
something.
Loss of. It may be beneficial, but it's all at the expense of pre-existing systems. So I use what I call the house analogy. And let's say in your house, you have the dining room, an interior wall, and your rec room. Now, your wife, being the Pittsburgh socialite she is, she wants to entertain more guests, so she needs a bigger dining room. And you scratch your head and say, well, the only way I know to get a bigger dining room is to knock out the interior wall, which is at the expense of not only that wall, but it's at the expense of your rec room. Now, it's beneficial in that she's happy, and everybody knows if she's happy, you're happy.
That's usually the case.
But don't tell a carpenter that the house was built by the process of knocking out interior walls. But that's exactly what the evolutionists are telling us. Oh, we evolved this new capability. We evolved legs, we evolved wings, we evolved walking by knocking out interior walls, by knocking out pre-existing systems. Evolution says we should be going up the mountain. Creation says, no, we were created at the top of the mountain, and what we're going to see is changes that go downward. And just from what we've been talking about, what do we observe? We observe we're going downward. See, so we're falling down off the mountain. We're not climbing up the mountain.
The mutations are actually causing us to lose things.
Correct. Pre-existing things that were there when God created us.
And that have a purpose. Maybe we don't know what that purpose is.
Yes.
But more and more as they look at the cell, they're seeing everything has a purpose. And so we may say, well, it's good in the face of this one event or this one addition. It's good to not have that. But then when that's gone, we still don't have that.
Right. It doesn't serve a function anymore. The mutation doesn't serve a function anymore. And as you say, we may have in fact lost some important capabilities. But even if we didn't lose an important capability, we haven't gained anything either. We haven't gone up the mountain.
What do evolutionists do to try to show a gain of something new?
What I just showed you. These are the examples.
They don't have anything else.
They don't have anything. These are the examples they give. And notice, remember we were talking about genotype and phenotype. They focus almost exclusively on the phenotype. Look, we gained this new trait. Well, what happened to the genotype? Well, we lost a pre-existing system. So how are you climbing Mount Improbable, regardless of what trait you may have gained? How are you climbing Mount Improbable by knocking out pre-existing systems?
Do they have any examples of actual, even the phenotype of a gain that they can find? Like, do they have any, fish that grow legs or something? I've heard people talk about the lungfish, for example, and, is there anything in the fossil record that you know of, or anything in the genetics of, ancestry that would show anything like this?
They'll point to different fossils that they say represent certain kinds of changes, but many times it's very difficult to interpret because coelacanth, for example, was assumed to be a fish evolving legs and learning to walk until a real coelacanth was actually found, and when they got observing it, it wasn't evolving legs at all. So it's very easy to make misinterpretations of fossils that you've never seen living. So they'll point to a fossil or something, say, see, this represents an intermediate form, but we don't really know because we've never seen it living. And regardless, my challenge is you don't have the genetics to back it up. You don't have the genetics to show that it wasn't specifically created that way to begin with.
So even if they don't find, the so-called missing link and they theorize it, they still have to show us genetically, how can this happen?
Exactly. They have no interpretation of the fossil record involves a viable theory, just like interpretation of evidence at a crime scene involves a viable theory. You may have all kinds of evidence pointing to the neighbor until you found out the neighbor died 3 weeks ago. And what that tells you is your interpretation was totally wrong.
And you have to revise it
and you got to
based
revise
upon
it.
the
Yes.
facts that you
So
discovered.
interpretation of the fossil record requires a viable theory. And I would challenge that evolution is not a viable theory. Therefore, it doesn't make any difference what you point to in the fossil record. Without a viable theory, without a viable genetic explanation, you're misinterpreting.
And it seems like if they could show something at the genetic level, why they wouldn't even really need to find the fossils, because they could say, hey, look, this is the way the process happens. This is the way it works. And if it works this way under the microscope, then we know it could happen.
That is such an excellent point. Yes, if they could actually go in the lab and demonstrate what they're claiming needs to happen, you wouldn't need the fossil. You'd say, here it is.
It's possible.
Yeah, exactly, it's possible.
But they haven't been able to do that.
They haven't been able to do that.
Well, I want to thank you for being on the show, Kevin.
My pleasure.
And hope to have you on again soon.
Thank you.
Evolutionists like Richard Dawkins claims that cell mutations actually are beneficial. Cell mutation drives evolution from low forms of life to higher forms of life. But what science actually shows is that mutations in the DNA, mutations in the cell, actually ultimately lose material, lose things, and harm the organism. It's not the world that Darwin says it was. It's not the world that Dawkins says it was. It's the world that God says it is. It just goes to show that we know again that what the Bible says is true, and the proof is all around you. Thanks for joining us for this edition of Origins, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching this edition of Origins. For a DVD of this series, you can order online or send a $12 donation to cover shipping and handling, and write to Origins Program, number 1908, Cornerstone Network, Wall, Pennsylvania, 15148.
This presentation was made possible by the faithful prayers and financial support of you, our Cornerstone family.